Okay, this lecture is on doing survey research. This covers the first part of Moorling Chapter 6. Um, this lecture is meant to supplement the chapter. Please do your reading. It's not meant to substitute doing the reading. It's just a supplement for reading the chapter. Okay, so here's the learning objectives. And then here's an overview of what will be covered in the lecture. The first thing to know in that creating a survey, you've got two major categories of question types that you can ask. So the first category would be an open-ended question, and this is when respondents can answer any way that they would like. These open-ended questions allow respondents to answer in their own words. There's several advantages of open-ended questions. The first is that they provide researchers with a lot of rich information. Um, they don't lead the respondent by suggesting specific answers, and then they're exploratory. They allow a researcher to know whether a respondent has anything at all to say about a topic. Um, and then really going back to the first idea about the richness of the data that is able to be generated, open-ended questions allow people to answer using their own words in their own language. So it really provides rich and detailed information. The major disadvantage, however, is that analyzing open-ended questions can be very difficult. It takes time to be able to process, encode, and categorize all the different responses that you get from respondents. And so this can be very difficult and time consuming. And for this reason, open-ended questions are also difficult to assess for reliability. Recall that reliability refers to consistency in responding, and so you can think of reliability as being test-retest or consistency between answers. So it's difficult to assess reliability as well. So the advantage is that you get very rich, detailed information, but they're just very difficult to analyze, to summarize the major themes from people's responses. And for this reason, survey researchers often used a forced choice format. And in a forced choice format, respondents have to select an answer from a set of choices that are written by the researcher. Um, so the major advantage is that it forces respondents' answers into dimensions that are of interest for the researcher, and so in this way avoids potentially irrelevant answers. They're also much easier to analyze. So in being able to address frequency claims or to come up with associations between variables or constructs, closed-ended, which is another word for forced choice, is just much easier. Um, so one disadvantage, though, is that even though the categories that respondents are provided with in terms of answer choices are typically of interest to the researchers, what if researchers haven't thought of everything? So researchers might not have identified all the important answers to the question. So a major limitation is that you can miss out on getting an answer. So just to summarize, an advantage is that they're easy to analyze and you get answers that are typically of interest to the researcher, but the disadvantage is that you don't get the richness of information. So of forced choice format, there's also several different ways to answer questions. And so one way is to provide respondents with rating scales. So we've reviewed Likert type items in the past, but a Likert item measures an attitude in terms of level of agreement or disagreement to a target statement. There's numerical values that correspond to each response category. It's assumed that there's a roughly equal interval distance in between each of the response categories. and that there's a neutral point in the middle that represents bivalence, that is neither agreeing nor disagreeing. A Likert scale consists of multiple Likert items. So what you see here is a single Likert item gauging people's amount of disagreement or agreement that the president is doing a good job. Several different items that asked about the president might assess somebody's favorability or approval or disapproval. And so several items about the president would be a Likert scale. Okay, so a Likert scale is different than a response scale. What you see as the response scale is that 1 to 5 choice there, right? So that's a Likert item. Now there's also Likert type items, and rather than providing a response scale, which is strongly disagree to strongly agree, there's different choices. So what you see here is a response scale that is meant to assess the frequency of behavior. And so it's the same idea, is that respondents get a target statement and then a set of response categories. Each of the response categories has a corresponding number. There's an assumed equal interval between each of the numbers. But here it might lack a neutral point. So here there's not a neutral point. So this is a Likert type item. And then if you want to see different types of Likert type response categories, or response anchors is another word. So a response anchor would refer to the verbal label that corresponds to each number. You can click on this hyperlink, and that'll just give you a sense of the types of response anchors that are out there. Okay, another way to ask a question on a rating scale is to use something called a semantic differential. So a semantic differential measures people's evaluations to things in terms of their ratings on a bipolar scale that has contrasting adjectives on each end. So I could ask you to rate Psych 255 on the following dimensions: interesting to dull, valuable to worthless, easy to difficult, fast-paced to slow-moving. So you notice that at each end of the continuum, there's basically opposites. The other thing you can do is you can put numbers in each of those spaces as a way to help your respondent kind of gauge their attitude. Okay. All right, so those were different types of questions. It's also important to keep in mind when creating surveys that wording really matters. And so there's a couple principles to follow when it comes to writing well-worded questions. Okay. First, just to try to emphasize why and how question wording matters. Let's take these two different options. The first question asks, do you favor cutting programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and farm subsidies to reduce the budget deficit? And people are given the forced choice, yes, no, or no opinion. Second question, do you favor cutting government entitlements to reduce the budget deficit? Yes, no, or no opinion. Okay. So the number of people that say yes, or the frequency is 23% for the first question, but 61 for the second. So notice that 61%, okay, a much higher number, would be in favor of cutting government entitlements. The interesting thing is that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and farm subsidies are all specific kinds of government entitlements. But you'll notice that only 23% say yes in that case, but 61% say yes when, instead of specifying each of the programs, the general term government entitlements is used. So the idea is that people are much less favorable about government entitlements because it has a negative connotation. This is also the case that people tend to respond more negatively to the phrase people on welfare versus the poor. And people are less likely to endorse items that use words like forbidden versus not allowed. So people can be very sensitive to slight differences in wording, and it's important to know that and to really be thoughtful when it comes to writing well-worded questions. As another example of the importance of writing well-worded questions, it's important not to write leading questions. So sometimes two questions seem to be asking the same thing, but they yield very different responses, and it just depends on how they're worded. So I've given you two examples here, but I'll give you a third. Consider people's responses to the following two questions. The first is the question would be phrased as, how fast do you think the car was going when it hit the other car? Alternatively, the question could be worded, how fast do you think the car was going when it smashed into the other car? Which question do you think people would lead people to give a higher speed estimate? It's probably the second, because the second had smashed in it. So these types of questions are leading questions, in that they kind of push a respondent to a particular answer. Okay, saying smashed is going to push people to have a higher estimate of speed. Asking a question, how much do you support Greenpeace's actions to save the environment, is going to lead to more support or endorsement, because of it's kind of leading people to give a particular answer. So avoid that. Another thing to avoid would be a double barrel question. And this is basically asking two questions in one. So for example, do you enjoy swimming and wearing sunscreen? Or I'm feeling unhappy and overworked. If you give a rating scale or a response scale, you aren't quite sure what people are responding to. Is it, in the first case, is it that they enjoy swimming? Or is it that they enjoy sunscreen? Or is it that they enjoy swimming and wearing sunscreen at the same time? We don't know. But the second one, is it that they're feeling happy? Is it that they're feeling overworked? Or is it that they're feeling unhappy and overworked? So ideally what we want to do is split out each of the elements of the question into their own question. Another thing to avoid are writing negatively worded questions. Let's take this statement. People who do not drive with a suspended license should never be punished. And then asking people the extent to which they disagree or agree. It's very confusing. It makes my brain hurt. It's much more straightforward to ask the question, people who drive with a suspended license should be punished, right? So we want to avoid negatively worded questions because they're difficult to interpret. It places a cognitive load on people, and it can obscure their true feelings about a question because they don't understand the question in the first place. All right. So that's how we word questions. In addition to how we word questions, it's important to think about the order of questions. Okay, so a general principle is that you want to put easy to understand and non-controversial items first. One reason is that you want people to persist with the survey and not give up or drop out. And so asking items that are easy to understand as well as non-controversial, it's less likely that people will drop out at the beginning because they don't understand, or they're offended, or they're sensitive to things. Okay. As a general principle, it's important to group by topic. So you want to ask questions that are related topically. It's cognitively easier for people to do that rather than skipping all over the place. But within topics, it can be important to rotate questions. So for instance, if you're trying to assess people's attitudes about affirmative action, it would be important to rotate or even randomize the order of questions within a block of questions that asked about affirmative action. Indeed, some research has shown that people's answers on this particular topic can be different depending on the order in which questions were asked. So as Morling reports in the chapter, when white people are asked about whether they support or oppose affirmative action for women, and then are subsequently asked whether they support or oppose affirmative action for racial minorities, a higher percentage of whites endorse or support affirmative action for racial minorities if asked after the question about supporting affirmative action for women. Presumably, this is all about consistency. If that most white people support affirmative action for women, and so supporting that policy, and then it would be very inconsistent to then not support affirmative action for racial minorities. So what they found is that when the second question about supporting or opposing affirmative action for racial minorities was asked first, there was fewer people that supported that question when asked first versus second. So again, just something to think about. Question order can really matter, and how people answer earlier questions can affect their answers to subsequent questions. All right, so how can we encourage accurate responses? Well, first, again, just to go back to one of the assumptions of survey report and a self-report methodology in general, is that there is an assumption that people can give meaningful responses. There's some things that are very easy to answer. It's easy for us to report our gender, our age, different demographic categories. And there's other things where you just have to ask a self-report. Like if you're asking people their thoughts and feelings, it's, how else do you get that information? But unfortunately, even though it's a widely used methodology, sometimes people can be lazy when they take surveys and they rely on different shortcuts. So the concept of response sets just means that people answer survey questions in a non-differentiated way. In other words, they put the same answer for all questions. And there's two specific types of response sets that are common: acquiescence and fence sitting. All right, so I'll give you examples coming up. So first, just an issue with non-differentiation, just to see what this would look like, is basically putting the exact same answer for all questions. And so this could be somebody's true response. I mean, with these particular questions, it would be surprising that people would disagree that they would disagree watching The Walking Dead, Westworld, Game of Thrones, and Stranger Things. I mean, that'd be weird because they're great shows. But even if they disagree because they don't really like TV, is it the case that they basically disagree versus strongly disagree, or neither agree or disagree? Like it just might lead you to believe that they're not thinking that hard. Another type of a response set is known as fence sitting. And so this is where people just pick the neutral point or the middle point and just kind of sit right on the fence. One way, and it's controversial, but we talked about it last time, is that you can get rid of fence sitting by eliminating that neutral point. And so rather than having a 5-point scale with a neutral point, you could just have a 4-point scale, an even number of items, and only have strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Okay, so some people do that in order to get rid of fence sitting, but the controversy is that some people might actually have a neutral attitude where they neither agree nor disagree because they're kind of in between. Okay, but that would be an example of non-differentiation, is just to pick that middle answer. And then acquiescence bias is another type of response set, and this is strongly agreeing with all statements or saying yes to everything. They're just inclined to say that they agree regardless of the content of the question. So if you only ask questions in this positive way, you might be the recipient of acquiescence bias. So one strategy is to ask questions in both a positively worded way as well as a negatively worded way. So if you have any reason to believe that respondents might be prone to acquiescence bias and just saying that they agree with everything, what you could do is include what are called negatively worded items or negatively phrased items, as you see in the red. And so if you got somebody that answered 5 to everything, that might lead you to believe that they're just acquiescing, okay? Because somebody that truly agrees with the items 1, 2, and 4 in the black font will probably not also strongly agree with questions or statements 3 and 5. So that would be a way to identify acquiescence bias, is by including those negatively worded items. Now, when using negatively worded items in a survey, you have to ultimately do something which is called reverse scoring. So let's just imagine that somebody would answer in the expected way to number 3, that if they truly did agree that Miramar provided an excellent education and that they learned a lot in their time here at Miramar, you'd expect them to answer either a disagree or a strongly disagree, or even a neutral. But then what you want to do is, because answering strongly disagree to this item would actually be an example of a positive attitude, scores of a 1 would be made into a 5. Okay, scores of a 2 would be made into a 4. In other words, you reverse score answers to reverse worded items. All right. So here's a couple other ways to try to encourage accurate responses, and it has to do with a couple things that people do when they take surveys, which is that they try to look good, they often try to report more than they know, and you want to avoid asking people to self-report memories of events. Okay, so let me go into each one of these. So social desirability refers to trying to look better than we are. Okay, trying to look smarter, stronger, happier, thinner, more successful, whatever it is. It's basically answering in a way that conveys a positive sense of oneself, either to others, or we even try to do it to ourselves. We engage in a certain amount of self-deception, okay? But so people that give socially desirable answers answer in a way to self-enhance. It's thought that social desirability might be a stable personality difference. That is, some people have a stronger need for social approval than others. Now, when asking surveys and when doing survey research, there are certain topics that are prone to social desirability bias. So asking about sexual behavior, drug use, basically anything illegal, somebody with a strong social desirability bias is likely going to downplay or diminish the extent to which they've engaged in those behaviors. Okay? But you can see some of the other categories as well. Racial attitudes, wealth, being healthy, engaging in exercise, even personality tests, that there's certain personality features like being conscientious, which are, socially approved. So in answering survey questions about topics that have a social desirability element to them, you need to be on the lookout for people giving answers and answering in a way in which they are self-enhancing. So how would you know? Well, so let me get to that in a minute. But one way to try to reduce social desirability in one's answers would first be to emphasize anonymity. So the idea would be, if people don't feel as though their answers can be traced back to them, they will answer ideally in an honest way and give their true response and not try to self-enhance. Okay, this can be done by collecting data over the computer or through the internet. But getting back to the idea of well, how might you know whether people are high in need for social approval and that might answer in social desirability ways? One thing that can be done is to include a measure of social desirability. And one such measure is called the Marlowe-Crown Social Desirability Scale. This scale consists of a series of true or false items. I only list 10 here. The full scale is more, but just to give you a sense of how it works. Okay, so some of these questions, when answered true, suggest that people would be answering in a social desirable way, and some, when answered false, would indicate that people are answering in a social desirable way. Okay, so here's the answers. So think about the first. I never hesitate to go out of my way to help someone in trouble. Okay, never. I never hesitate. Okay, so somebody that says true might be answering in a social desirable way. What about the second one? I have never intensely disliked anyone. Okay, never, never ever. Somebody that said true might be answering in a socially desirable way. Now, for any one person, that could be true. But what you do is over these 10 items or 20 items, if you use the first scale, is just count up how many socially desirable answers people have. And that's a way to get a sense as to whether somebody is higher or lower in need for social approval. So if you had 20 of these true-false statements and they gave the socially desirable response on all 20, that might be an indication that they're answering in a socially desirable way on your other questions. So if you're asking about sexual behavior or drug use or anything else that might be sensitive or prone to self-enhancement, you might say to yourself, I don't know if I can trust that person's responses because they got a 20 out of 20 on my social desirability scale. So that would be a way to potentially screen out people as potentially problematic. Okay? You never quite know, but somebody that got a 20 out of 20 on this scale, I would say was not somebody that I would necessarily trust if they were in my survey data. Okay. Another way to reduce social desirability is to increase confidentiality or to assure people of confidentiality. And there's a couple of different ways in which you could do that. Again, confidentiality is not the same as anonymity. Anonymity, people don't provide any personally identifying information. Confidentiality, people might provide personally identifying information. It is just not linked to their responses. So often it's necessary to get people's personal information from them as a way to do follow-up questionnaires or to get additional responses to them from them. But you just don't want to link their personal information with their actual answers to questions. Okay. A couple other things to keep in mind would be to avoid certain types of questions. And the first would be asking people for the causes of their thoughts and actions. So there's a phenomenon that people often self-report more than they can know. And this is the idea that people are very capable of providing reasons for their behaviors, even though they might not know the true cause of their behavior. So if I asked you, why do you always buy a particular brand of yogurt? I'm quite sure that you could come up with an answer. It might be because you think it's the most nutritious. It might be because you think it tastes the best. But what psychologists have learned is that the answers that people give aren't necessarily the true reasons. So this is just the idea that if forced to give a reason for their behavior, people will give a reason. Why? Because it would be dissonant not to have a reason for one's behavior. Okay, smart, reasonable people know why they do things, even though we know that sometimes we really don't. So when you ask people to give a reason or a cause of their behavior, you will get an answer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually why people do something. And again, it doesn't mean that they're lying, or it doesn't mean that they're being deceptive. It's just that they might not be fully aware, but you will get an answer often. Okay, so it's best to avoid asking people about the causes of their thoughts or behaviors. Another thing to avoid would be to ask people to recall what they thought at some specific time in the past or for their memory of a specific event. And this just has to do with the imperfect nature of our memory. Our memories are very fallible. So, if you were asked the question, when was the last time you took your car to the car wash? What were you wearing on your 21st birthday? Where were you and what were you doing when you got your acceptance letter to college? People's memories for these types of events just aren't all that great. And it's important to know that Confidence and accuracy are not related. They're not necessarily related. So that people might feel very confident about what they report, even if they're not accurate. Okay? So sometimes people are confident and accurate, but sometimes they're confident and not accurate. So confidence and accuracy don't necessarily go together. All right, so that's it for this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, please do make sure to read the chapter, as there's a lot of really good information in there as well.